Chapter 1: The Marriage of Shadows. The gentle rustle of leaves in the wind was the only sound as the carriage slowly made its way up the long, winding road toward the mansion. Elara Wynford sat rigidly inside, her hands clutching the delicate lace of her wedding gown, fingers trembling ever so slightly. She couldn't shake the feeling that this journey was the beginning of something far darker than anyone had told her. The blindfold over her eyes wasn't just a symbol of her husband's eccentricities. It felt like a noose slowly tightening around her world. Her father had assured her it was necessary, an unusual but harmless condition, he had said. After all, Lord Kael Varrow had saved them from ruin. A single meeting, a single contract, and their family's debts were erased, their lands preserved. In return, Elara had become the bargaining chip. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. But now, as she sat blindfolded in the carriage, her heart raced with a growing sense of dread. The blindfold was an unsettling command. She was not to see her new husband, ever. Not directly, not fully. He had insisted on this as the primary rule of their marriage. She would live in his house, dine at his table, share his bed, but never see his face. The idea was absurd, and yet she had agreed, her father's desperation too overwhelming to resist. The carriage came to a stop, and Elara heard the soft creak of the door being opened. A hand reached out for hers, guiding her gently down the steps. "Welcome, my lady," came a soft, unfamiliar voice. It wasn't her husband. She knew this because it lacked the deep timbre of the man she had exchanged vows with that morning. The one who had spoken in barely more than a whisper. With her blindfold still in place, Elara's other senses seemed heightened. The air here was cooler and tinged with the scent of roses. But beneath it, something darker lingered, an earthy, almost metallic scent that made her shiver. The servant led her forward, her footsteps echoing on the stone path. She could hear the distant sound of the sea crashing against the cliffs. The estate was isolated, far from the town and the gossiping tongues that spoke of Lord Varrow's secrets. Even now, whispers of his monstrous appearance and eerie reclusiveness followed him like a shadow. "Elara." The voice startled her, soft and smooth yet resonating with power. Her heart skipped a beat. "Kael," she whispered, her lips dry. "My lord." There was a pause, a tension she could feel in the air between them. She could sense his presence even though she couldn't see him. He was close, closer than she had expected. The scent of him was all around her, musky and rich. "I trust the journey wasn't too tiring?" His voice was deep, but controlled. He didn't seem particularly interested in her answer. "No, not at all." Her voice trembled despite her efforts to sound composed. Another pause. "You may remove the blindfold when you are alone in the garden," he said, almost as if reading from a script. "But never in my presence. This is my only rule." Elara bit her lip, nodding even though she knew he couldn't see her expression. She could feel his gaze, though, burning through the blindfold, dissecting her. The sound of footsteps echoed in the stone hallway as she was guided deeper into the mansion. Every turn felt like a twist in a labyrinth, every doorway a new layer of the prison she had just entered. As she was led to her chambers, a weight settled in her chest. She was now Lady Varrow, but what kind of life had she entered? And more importantly, who was the man she had married? Chapter 2: The First Night. The vastness of her chambers was overwhelming. Even with the blindfold still in place, Elara could feel the space surrounding her, the high ceilings, the cold marble floors, the heavy curtains that seemed to muffle even the slightest sound. When the door finally closed, and she was left alone, she hesitated. Her hands trembled as they reached up to untie the blindfold. For a moment, she feared what she might see. But when the fabric slipped from her eyes, the first thing she noticed was not a horror, but beauty. Her room was enormous, decorated with lush tapestries and fine furniture. A grand fireplace crackled in the corner, casting a warm glow over the deep mahogany wood that adorned the walls. There were large windows, though they were covered with thick velvet drapes, blocking out the moonlight. But despite the grandeur, a coldness lingered. The mansion's beauty was suffocating in its perfection, as if it were merely a facade hiding something far darker beneath the surface. Elara moved toward the window, her fingers brushing the heavy drapes aside just enough to peer outside. The garden below was vast, stretching out toward the cliffs. In the distance, she could hear the waves crashing against the rocks. It was a place that should have been peaceful, but instead, it felt isolated, trapped within its own darkness. She turned back to the room, her gaze falling on a small table beside the bed. A letter sat there, sealed with black wax. Her heart raced as she reached for it, recognizing the familiar, elegant script of her husband. Elara. I will not come to you tonight. Rest. We have time. Kael. The letter was brief, formal, yet it left her feeling strangely disappointed. She had expected him to be here, to join her as a husband would. But instead, she was left alone. Alone in a house that felt too large, too silent, too full of secrets. Her fingers traced the edges of the letter, wondering what kind of man would write such words. What kind of man would bind his wife with a blindfold and hide himself behind a mask? Her thoughts drifted back to the ceremony earlier that day. It had been brief, almost businesslike. Kael had worn a mask, of course, something dark and intricately designed, concealing all but his eyes. Those eyes had been striking, sharp, and filled with an intensity that had made her shiver. But they had also been filled with sadness, a deep, haunting sorrow she couldn't quite place. As she undressed and slipped into the large, cold bed, her mind raced with questions. Who was Kael Varrow? And why had he chosen her? Sleep came slowly that night, her thoughts chasing her into dreams filled with shadows and whispers. Chapter 3 Whispers in the Dark. The next morning, Elara awoke to the soft sound of rain tapping against the windows. For a moment, she lay still, trying to orient herself in the unfamiliar room. The events of the previous day came flooding back, and she felt a pang of unease. The mansion was eerily quiet. She dressed slowly, the heavy silence pressing in on her as she moved through the empty halls. She had been told she could explore the grounds freely, and so she made her way toward the garden, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. The garden was beautiful, with winding paths, blooming flowers, and ancient trees. But even here, a sense of isolation lingered. The cliffs loomed in the distance, and beyond them, the endless sea stretched out, cold and unforgiving. As she walked, her thoughts returned to Kael. She had expected him to join her, to make some effort to get to know her as his wife. But instead, he had kept his distance, hidden behind his mask and his rules. The blindfold rule puzzled her the most. What was it he didn't want her to see? His face? His life? The truth? That night, as the rain continued to fall, Kael came to her chambers. He didn't enter, didn't even knock, but she heard his voice through the door, soft, deep, and distant. I will not keep you here against your will, he said, his words muffled by the door. You may leave if you wish. Elara's heart raced at the sound of his voice. Leave? She echoed, confused. I don't understand. I will provide for your family, regardless of your decision. If you wish to stay, you must accept my conditions. If you wish to leave, you may do so without consequence. Elara was taken aback by the offer. It wasn't what she had expected. But something in his voice, in the way he spoke those words, made her hesitate. I don't want to leave, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I want to understand. There was a long pause on the other side of the door, and for a moment, Elara wondered if he had left. But then, he spoke again, his voice lower, more somber. Some things are not meant to be understood, Elara. And with that, he was gone. Chapter 4 Beneath the Surface. Days passed in the mansion, and with each one, Elara grew more restless. The silence, the secrecy, the rules, they were all oppressive, weighing on her mind. Kael's absence gnawed at her. He would visit her chamber each night, speaking to her through the door, his voice dark and hypnotic, always keeping that distance between them. But she longed for more. She wanted to see him, to touch him, to understand the man she was married to. One evening, as she stood by the large window in her chambers, staring out into the night, the door creaked open slightly. Kael stood in the shadows, his mask gleaming faintly in the candlelight. His presence was magnetic, and her breath caught in her throat. "Elara," he said, his voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. "Are you finding your time here unbearable?" She shook her head, though she couldn't deny the sense of entrapment she felt. "No, but I don't understand. You speak to me through a door, you wear a mask, you've put me in this blindfolded existence. How am I supposed to be your wife if I can't even look at you?" Kael stepped into the room, closer than he had ever been before. The heat of his body was palpable, and her pulse quickened. He still kept his distance, but something had shifted. There was a tension now, something electric humming between them. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, his voice low, almost dangerous. "You don't know the weight of the things you're trying to uncover." Elara's gaze didn't waver. "Then show me. Let me see who you really are. Whatever it is, it can't be worse than this." Kael's jaw clenched behind the mask. For a moment, she thought he might turn and leave again, but then he took another step forward, closing the gap between them. He was so close now, the heat from his body rolling off him in waves. Elara's heart pounded in her chest, her skin tingling with anticipation. "Do you think you could love a man like me, Elara?" His voice was a dark whisper, filled with raw intensity. "Could you love someone you'll never truly know?" The tension between them was thick, heavy with unspoken desires. Elara swallowed, her throat dry. She didn't know how to answer. How could she, when she wasn't sure what he was hiding, or why he kept himself locked behind that mask? "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But I want to try. Let me in, Kael. Please." His breath was ragged now, and for a moment, she thought he might touch her, might finally cross that invisible line between them. But then he pulled back, his body stiffening as if he were battling some inner demon. "I can't," he said, his voice rough, almost pained. "Not yet." And with that, he turned and left, the door closing behind him with a finality that left Elara reeling. Chapter 5: Secrets in the Night. The days stretched on, filled with a growing tension that Elara could barely contain. Every night, Kael visited her, always keeping that infuriating distance, and every night, she felt the pull between them grow stronger. There was something simmering beneath the surface, something dark and powerful. She could feel it in the way his voice lowered when he spoke her name, in the way his presence filled the room, even from behind the closed door. Her days were spent wandering the mansion and the grounds, seeking answers in the silence. She had come to know the house well by now, its sprawling rooms, its shadowed hallways. But there were places she was not allowed to go, doors that remained locked, their secrets hidden behind layers of mystery. And the staff, though polite, were evasive. They never spoke about Kael, never addressed the rumors or the whispers that had followed him for years. It wasn't until one night, when the storm outside raged with a fury that matched her own restlessness, that something changed. Elara had been lying in bed, listening to the rain pound against the windows, when she heard a noise. It was faint, barely a sound at all, but enough to pull her from the edge of sleep. Sitting up, she listened more intently, her heart pounding in her chest. There it was again, a soft, scraping noise, like someone moving something heavy across the floor. Curiosity and fear battled within her, but in the end, it was curiosity that won. Slipping out of bed, she wrapped herself in a robe and quietly opened the door to her chambers. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint flicker of candlelight from the wall sconces. The noise had come from deeper within the mansion, from the west wing, a place Kael had expressly forbidden her to enter. Her heart raced as she made her way down the hall, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. The sound grew louder as she approached, and soon, she found herself standing before a large wooden door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, Elara pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond was unlike anything she had seen in the mansion. It was dark, the air thick with the scent of earth and something metallic. The walls were lined with strange artifacts, old weapons, ancient books, things that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a private home. In the center of the room, a massive iron door stood open, revealing a passage that led deep underground. Elara's pulse quickened. What was this place? And why had Kael hidden it from her? Suddenly, a hand closed around her wrist, pulling her back with a force that made her gasp. "What are you doing here?" Kael's voice was harsh, his grip tight. Elara's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to face him. He was still wearing his mask, but his eyes were blazing with anger. She had never seen him like this before, so raw, so unguarded. I heard a noise," she stammered. "I was curious." "You shouldn't be here," he growled, his voice dangerously low. "There are things in this house you don't understand, things you should never try to uncover." "Then explain it to me." Elara shot back, her frustration boiling over. "I'm your wife, Kael. Why won't you let me in? Why won't you trust me?" For a moment, Kael just stared at her, his chest heaving with barely controlled anger. Then, without a word, he released her wrist and turned away, his shoulders tense. "Go back to your room," he said coldly. "Now." Elara hesitated, her heart aching at the distance between them. But she could see that he wasn't going to give her any answers tonight. Reluctantly, she turned and left, her mind swirling with questions. Chapter 6: The Masked Stranger. The following days were a blur. Elara couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen, the strange room, the hidden passage, and most of all, Kael's reaction. He had been furious, but there had been something else in his eyes that she couldn't quite place. Fear. What was he so afraid of? Her thoughts were interrupted one evening when a letter arrived for her. It was from her father, and as she read the familiar handwriting, her heart sank. "Dearest Elara, there are rumors swirling in the town, rumors about your husband, about the Varrow family. I had hoped they were nothing more than idle gossip, but I fear they may be true. I beg you to return home. There are things about the Varrow estate you do not know, things I should have told you before you married him. It may not be safe for you there." Elara's hands shook as she read the words. What was her father talking about? What was he hiding from her? That night, as she waited for Kael's nightly visit, her mind raced. She had to confront him, had to demand the truth. But when the door creaked open and Kael stepped inside, she felt her resolve waver. He was different tonight. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her pulse quicken, and the air between them was charged with a tension she couldn't ignore. "Why are you hiding from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved closer to her, his eyes locked on hers. The air around them seemed to crackle with something dangerous, something electric. "Do you really want to know?" he asked, his voice low and filled with something dark. Elara nodded, her breath catching in her throat. Without warning, Kael reached up and removed his mask. For the first time, she saw his face, scarred, beautiful, and broken all at once. But it wasn't the scars that shocked her. It was the look in his eyes, the raw vulnerability that he had been hiding behind that mask for so long. "I'm not the man you think I am," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm a monster, Elara. And I've done things I can never take back." Elara's heart ached at the pain in his voice, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, reaching out to touch his face. The moment her fingers brushed his skin, Kael let out a ragged breath, and the tension between them snapped. Without thinking, Elara closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was filled with all the questions, all the desires, all the emotions that had been building between them for so long. Kael hesitated for only a moment before his arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. The heat between them was undeniable, and for the first time, Elara felt like she was truly connecting with the man beneath the mask. But as their passion flared, a dark thought lingered in the back of her mind. What had Kael meant when he called himself a monster? And what dark secrets still lay hidden in the shadows of the Varrow mansion? Chapter 7.